The sea breeze in Biddeford has always smelled like freedom to me. Even now, when I'm 67, I wake up at dawn, and the first thing I do is open my bedroom window to breathe in that salty, iodine-soaked air. 40 years ago, when I first started my business, the same air filled my sails, both literally and figuratively. My name is Hubert Dwyer. I've spent my whole life on the sea and in shipping. I started out as a simple sailor, then became a captain, and at 30, I bought my first ship of my own. 15 years later, Dwyer Marine became one of the largest shipping companies on the coast of Maine. I earned every cent of my fortune with my own sweat and blood, and I'm proud of it. I met Sylvia when I was 36. She was the daughter of Ezra Radley, owner of the largest fish canning factory on the East Coast. In her 28 years, she possessed that rare, exquisite beauty that doesn't fade with the years. But what struck me most were her eyes, gray as a stormy sea and just as unpredictable. We met at a charity event at the town hall. I was already quite successful then, but still considered an upstart among the local elite. Sylvia crossed the hall to speak to me as I stood at the window, watching the harbor at night. "You must be Mr. Dwyer," she said then. "They say you know more about the sea than everyone else in this hall put together." I remember smiling. "And you must be Miss Radley. They say you've turned down the marriage proposals of half the eligible bachelors in New England." She laughed, and that laugh changed my life forever. We were married 6 months later. Ezra Radley was not thrilled with his daughter's choice. He had hoped for a more aristocratic son-in-law, but Sylvia was adamant. The old man accepted it, especially when he saw that I showed no interest in his money. "I have ambitions of my own, sir," I told him, "and enough money to give your daughter a decent life." A year after we were married, our daughter Eloise was born. Sylvia wanted an unusual name for our girl, and I agreed, although I secretly preferred simpler names. From the first days, it was clear that Eloise was a copy of her mother. The same gray eyes, the same stubborn chin. The first years of our married life were almost cloudless. I worked hard, expanding the company, often going to sea for weeks at a time. Sylvia took care of the house and Eloise's upbringing. We had a mansion on a hill overlooking the harbor, not the biggest in town, but spacious and comfortable. I had insisted that we buy it with my money, although Sylvia had inherited an impressive fortune when her father died. The trouble started when Eloise turned 16. She always gravitated more toward her mother, but in her teens, her estrangement from me became obvious and painful. "You're never home," she'd say to me. "You care more about your ships than your own family." I tried to explain to her that it was the ships that made it possible for us to live the way we did. But Eloise just rolled her eyes and went to her room, slamming the door. At 21, she left to attend a prestigious college on the West Coast, as far away from Biddeford and me as possible. That's where she met Kingsley Cavendish. Tall, with slicked back dark hair and a perpetual half smile on his lips, he was studying finance and came from a family with a big name, but no money. Eloise had brought him home for Christmas vacation, and I sensed something fake about him. "Mr. Dwyer," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "Eloise has told me so much about your impressive career. It must be amazing to build such an empire from scratch." There was admiration in his voice, but his eyes remained cold and assessing. They glided over the furnishings of our home, as if estimating the value of each item. Sylvia, however, was fascinated. "He's from a good family, Hubert," she told me that night. "And Eloise is so happy with him." "A good family doesn't mean a good man," I replied. "There's something wrong with him, Sylvia. I can feel it." She sighed and shook her head. "You're too strict. You're always looking for a catch. Perhaps it's the years of business negotiations, but I've rarely been wrong about people. And Kingsley Cavendish made me more suspicious with every visit. They were married 2 years after they met. It was a lavish wedding. Sylvia insisted on it. I paid all the expenses, though I shuddered inwardly at the thought of giving my only daughter to a man I didn't trust. After the wedding, they moved to Boston. Kingsley took a job at an investment firm. Eloise took up interior design, more as a hobby than a real career. Their visits to Biddeford became less and less frequent, and when they did come, I could feel the growing tension. "How's business, Father?" Eloise asked at dinner. "Still sending ships to distant lands?" There was a sneer in her question, as if my business were something outdated and frivolous. "Everything is fine," I answered with restraint. "And how are your investments, Kingsley?" He was always talking about grand plans and promising deals, But I could see Sylvia glancing furtively at Eloise, as if they were discussing something behind my back. When Sylvia turned 60, she was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors gave 3 to 5 years with the right treatment. I was devastated but vowed to do everything I could to make those years her happiest. We traveled: Paris, Venice, Istanbul, Kyoto. I cut my working hours to a minimum, handing over most of the running of the company to my deputy, Walter Penbrook. We spent long evenings on the veranda of our house, watching sunsets over the bay and reminiscing about the years gone by. Eloise and Kingsley came more often after the news of Sylvia's illness, but I noticed a change in their behavior. Eloise became especially attentive to her mother, but colder to me. Kingsley often secluded himself with Sylvia in the library, and after these conversations, she looked at me strangely, doubtfully. One evening, about a year before Sylvia died, I happened to overhear a conversation between a daughter and her mother. "Mother, you have to be realistic," Eloise said in a muffled but insistent voice. Father has never loved you the way you deserve. He married you for your money and Radley's position." I froze outside the door, not believing my ears. "Eloise," Sylvia's voice sounded tired, "your father never took a dime of my inheritance. He insisted that we live on his income." "Of course he insisted. It's part of his game." The daughter's voice rang with rage. "He's more cunning than you realize. He's always playing the noble game, and he's always playing the noble game." I didn't listen any further. I quietly walked away from the door and spent a sleepless night in my office, trying to understand how my own daughter could have distorted reality so much. The next day I tried to talk to Sylvia. "What is going on between you and Eloise?" I asked bluntly. "What did you two talk about yesterday?" Sylvia looked away. "She's worried about my condition, about what will happen after me. We're not talking about money, are we?" My voice trembled. "Hubert," Sylvia took my hand, "you know I've always trusted you. Don't mind Eloise. She's just frightened." But I saw a shadow of doubt in her eyes. The seed sown by our daughter has sprouted. During the last months of Sylvia's life, Eloise practically moved in with us, sending Kingsley back to Boston to take care of business. She spent all her time with her mother, often whispering with her, silent when I entered the room. I felt like a stranger in my own home, but tolerated for Sylvia's sake. She was fading away day by day, and my only concern was to ease her suffering. A week before the end, Sylvia asked to be alone with her. Eloise resisted, but her mother was persistent. "Hubert," Sylvia said when we were alone, her voice barely audible, "I know you have always loved me truly. I'm sorry I doubted it." I squeezed her hand, unable to speak because of the lump in my throat. "I've prepared a will," she continued. Percival, nodding, was handling all the details. "Promise me you won't argue with what it says." "Sylvia, I don't want some—" "Promise," she interrupted me with sudden firmness. "I promise," I said. She died in her sleep 3 days later. The funeral was held in the Old St. Thomas's Church on the hill. The whole of Biddeford seemed to be there. Sylvia was beloved in town for her kindness, for her support of local schools and hospitals, for never boasting about her wealth. I sat in the front row, feeling empty inside. Eloise sat next to me, but as if a mile away, straight, dry-eyed, in a perfectly fitting black dress. Kingsley had returned from Boston the day before, and now had his hand on his wife's shoulder, his face expressing sorrow, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. After the service in the cemetery, I stood at the fresh grave, accepting condolences from an endless string of people. Eloise kept to herself, talking to Sylvia's distant relatives, defiantly not noticing me. As the crowd began to disperse, I was approached by Percival, nodding, a short, full man with a neat gray beard, Radley's family attorney for 3 decades. "My deepest condolences, Hubert," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Sylvia was an exceptional woman." "Thank you, Percival," I replied. "She trusted you very much." He nodded, then lowered his voice. "We need to discuss her last will and testament." "Not here, of course. Come to my office in a week. I've already informed Eloise." Kingsley came over to us at that moment, his hand sliding over my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to look comforting but felt insincere. "What a sad loss for all of us," he said. "Sylvia was a real lady of the old school." Then, leaning nearer, he added, As soon as the formalities of the Eloise and I would like to discuss the future of the mansion. You do realize that it would be burdensome to maintain such a large house on your own, don't you? I looked at him with a look of disgust. Sylvia's body had barely been interred, and he was already planning how to dispose of her possessions. We'll discuss this another time, Kingsley, I said coldly. He backed away with a slight smile, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He and Eloise were already sharing the skin of the unkilled bear, certain that Sylvia's entire fortune, the 35 million accumulated over the Radley generations, was now theirs. I returned home alone, having declined Eloise's offer of a wake. Our big house greeted me with silence. Going up to my bedroom with Sylvia, I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself cry for the first time in days. After the funeral, the house had become even emptier and more droning. I wandered through the rooms, touching Sylvia's things, breathing in her fading scent. Every morning, in the habit of 40 years, I made 2 cups of tea, and every morning the second remained untouched. Eloise and Kingsley had decided to stay in Biddeford, while all the formalities were being settled, as they put it, but not in our house. They took a room at the Harbor View, the best hotel in town. My daughter's presence should have been a comfort, but her infrequent visits only added to my pain. The 3rd day after the funeral, she arrived alone, without Kingsley. She sat across from me in the living room, so elegant in her black suit, with the pearl earrings that had once belonged to Sylvia. "How are you, Father?" she asked me without much interest, more out of politeness. "I'm doing fine," I answered. "Day by day." She nodded as if checking a box on a list of obligatory questions. "I think we need to discuss practical matters," she said, turning to the real purpose of her visit. "What do you plan to do with the house? It's too big for one person." I looked at her, puzzled. "This is my house, Eloise. It's Sylvia's and mine. I'm not going anywhere." She pressed her lips together. "But the upkeep of a mansion like this? It's a huge expense. Maybe it makes sense to sell it while real estate prices are high. I could help you find something more suitable." I said no. My voice got harder. "I have enough money to maintain this house. I built it with your mother. Every room holds our memories." Eloise sighed as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "I'm just suggesting you think about it practically, Father. You're not getting any younger. Sooner or later, you're going to need help." "When I do, I'll hire someone," I replied. "Right now, if you don't mind, I'm a little tired." She left annoyed, but I knew this was just the beginning. The next week, the town started buzzing with rumors. At first, it was cautious hints, then increasingly explicit talk. I noticed this when I walked into the Blue Oyster, a pub on the waterfront where I'd been meeting friends on Fridays for years. The conversation at a neighboring table had died down when I walked in. Old Tom Redfern, the fishing fleet owner we'd known for 30 years, only nodded at me instead of his usual loud greeting. Pete, the bartender, brought my usual whiskey, but avoided making eye contact. "What's going on, Pete?" I asked bluntly. "Shamadiyurum." Why is everyone looking at me like I'm a leper? Pete shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "It's nothing, Mr. Dwyer. It's just, people have been saying different things since after Sylvia died." I finished it for him. "What did they say?" "Nonsense," Pete blushed. "It's not worth paying attention to." But I persisted, and finally he said reluctantly, "They say that Mrs. Dwyer might have lived longer if you'd taken more care of her, that you didn't take her to the clinic in Boston because it was too expensive." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What? Who's talking?" "I don't know exactly." Pete looked away. "Rumors, you know how they spread." But I already knew the source of the rumors. When I got home, I called Dr. Mortimer, who had been treating Sylvia for the last 2 years. "Hubert," he said when he heard my question, "this is a load of nonsense. Sylvia has received the best treatment possible. We consulted with specialists from Boston, New York, and even Europe. Her form of cancer was incurable from the start, and you did everything you could to make her last years comfortable and dignified. So someone is spreading rumors that I spared money for her treatment," I said, still seething with anger. There was a pause on the other end of the wire. "Eloise came to see me last week," Mortimer said at last. "She asked me strange questions about the course of treatment, about whether there were other options." I explained the situation to her, as I've explained it to you now, but I got the impression she was looking for a different answer. I thanked him and hung up the phone, feeling an emptiness growing inside, even deeper than the grief for Sylvia. My own daughter was trying to smear me in the eyes of the town that had been my home for over 40 years. The days stretched on, filled with silence and memories. I started going out to the wharf every morning, watching the ships come and go. It calmed me down, reminding me of my years at sea. Occasionally, I would stop by the Dwyer Marine office to check on things, but I quickly tired of the sympathetic looks from the staff. One day, coming back from the marina, I noticed an unfamiliar car at the gate of our house, a silver Lexus with Boston license plates. I slowed my step going up the hill and saw Eloise coming out of the house with a well-dressed middle-aged couple. "And the porch looks right out over the bay," she said, pointing to the west side of the house. "On clear days, you can see for dozens of miles." The woman nodded admiringly, and the man wrote something down in a small notebook. I watched the scene in silence until they noticed me. "Father!" Eloise exclaimed, her face changing instantly. "I didn't expect you back so early." "Obviously," I replied dryly, shifting my gaze to the strangers. "May I ask what's going on in my house?" The man stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Randall Peabody, Mr. Dwyer. And this is my wife, Miriam. Your daughter has been showing us around this beautiful mansion." "She did?" "I didn't shake your outstretched hand." "And for what purpose?" "Well, we're looking for property in the area, and when we heard that this historic mansion might be on the market, this house is not for sale, I cut him off." Mr. Peabody looked confusedly at Eloise, who quickly intervened. "Father, we were just discussing possibilities. Nothing concrete." "In my house, without my knowledge," my voice sounded icily calm, though everything was boiling inside. "I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Peabody, but you're going to have to leave. And in the future, if you're interested in real estate in Biddeford, I suggest you contact an official agent." The couple awkwardly said goodbye and hurriedly got into their car. As soon as they drove away, I turned to Eloise. "How dare you?" "Don't be dramatic, Father." She crossed her arms over her chest. "I'm just exploring my options. Everyone knows you can't keep this house without Mom's money." "I built this house with my own money, Eloise." I gritted my teeth. "And I've kept it all these years with my own money, too. Sylvia never spent a cent of her inheritance on this house." "Of course you would say that," she grinned. "But we all know the truth. You've always only wanted Radley's money. It's the only reason you married Mom." I stared at her, struck by the bitterness in her words. "Do you really believe that?" I asked quietly. "After all these years?" "Oh, I grew up watching you neglect her." Eloise didn't look away. "Always at sea, always at work. And then, when she got sick, I did everything I could." My voice trembled. "I loved your mother more than anything in the world. But not enough to save her." Eloise cut her off. "Look, Father, let's not quarrel. Percival will read the will in a week's time, and everything will be clear. In the meantime, maybe you should start thinking about where you're going to move. This house is too big for you alone." With those words, she got into her car, parked nearby, and drove off, leaving me standing in the driveway, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the poison of the present. The week before I met Percival dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. I barely left the house for fear of more rumors and gossip. Only twice did I call Walter about company business, giving him instructions. The rest of the time I paged through photos and read old letters from Sylvia, trying to find comfort in them. The evening before the appointment, I heard a car pull up. Looking out my office window, I saw Kingsley's automobile. He and Eloise got out, talking animatedly. I was about to go down and meet them, but something stopped me. Perhaps fatigue from the constant confrontations, perhaps curiosity. They entered without ringing the bell. Eloise still had the key. I heard their voices in the hallway. Then they moved into the living room directly below my office. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but their voices echoed up through the ventilation shaft. "Is everything ready?" Kingsley asked. "Yes," Eloise replied. "I talked to Percival today. He said that my mother left me the bulk of the inheritance as we expected." "Great," Kingsley's voice sounded pleased. 35 million? We can finally breathe easy." "What do you mean?" Eloise's voice became strained. A pause. It's nothing. It's just, you know how difficult the market is right now? Some of my investments haven't yielded the returns I expected. Kingsley. Sure, Eloise's voice has gotten dangerously quiet. There's something you're not telling me. Another pause, then a heavy sigh. Okay, if you want to know the truth, we're in trouble. The last real estate deal in Washington turned out to be a disaster. I lost most of our capital. What? Eloise exclaimed. You never told me that. How bad is it? Bad enough, Kingsley admitted. But it doesn't matter now. Tomorrow you'll get your mom's inheritance, and all our problems will be solved. I froze, shocked by what I heard. My daughter wasn't the only one who thought I was a heartless dowry hunter. Her husband was exactly what I'd always suspected. What about her father? Eloise asked after a long pause. What about him? Kingsley's voice sounded indifferent. I understand from Percival that Sylvia left him some change, enough to keep him off the streets, maybe a small cottage or an apartment. But that house would have to be sold, of course. He'll resist, said Eloise. You can see how he clings to the past. He won't have a choice, Kingsley said. The house belonged to your mother, and now it will belong to you. I've already contacted several potential buyers, including Peabody. They're willing to pay a fair amount, especially if we do some remodeling. But what if Dad refuses to move out? Then we'll force him. Kingsley's voice was steel now. Legally, of course. He's not old, after all. We could raise questions about his ability to live on his own, especially after all the talk about how he'd neglected Sylvia during her illness. Eloise laughed, and that laugh, so similar to her mother's but distorted with anger, pierced me like a knife. Yes, it was a good idea. Old Mortimer didn't support it, of course, but a lot of people in town already believed it, especially after I talked to Mrs. Flanders of the charity committee. See, Kingsley said, everything's going according to plan. Tomorrow we'll get the money, start the process with the house, and soon we'll be free of all these problems. I just want it to be over, Eloise sighed. This house, this town, they've never really been mine. My father always paid more attention to his ships than he did to me. And now you can repay him in kind. Kingsley sounded pleased. Let's get out of here. We have a big day tomorrow. I heard them stand up, their footsteps moving toward the exit, the front door slamming shut, and then the sound of a car pulling away. I remained seated in my chair, stunned by what I had heard. My own daughter and her husband weren't just waiting for Sylvia's inheritance. They were actively vilifying me, plotting to kick me out of my own home, which I had built with my own hands and money. I felt a deafening rage rising inside. Not so much because of the money, they had never been the most important thing to me, but because of the betrayal, because of the distortion of my whole life with Sylvia, the transformation of our love story into a sordid tale of calculation and self-interest. I stood up and went to the window. Below was the bay, silvery in the moonlight. Somewhere out there on the horizon, my 3 ships were returning from a long voyage, laden with goods from Southeast Asia. My life's work, which my daughter saw as just a way to avoid family obligations. Tomorrow in Percival's office, everything would be decided. I didn't know what was in Sylvia's will, but now I understood why she insisted on my promise not to argue with her decision. She must have left the bulk of her fortune to Eloise, perhaps out of guilt for my alleged failure to give my daughter enough attention as a child. Well, so be it. I never laid claim to Sylvia's money. I had enough of my own money to live the rest of my life in comfort, even if I had to buy a new house. But one thing I knew for sure, I would not let Eloise and Kingsley distort the truth about my life with Sylvia, about our love, which had been real and pure all these 40 years. With that determination, I went to bed, preparing for tomorrow, which promised to be a turning point in my life. The morning was chilly with low clouds and drizzling rain, as if nature itself was setting me up for an unpleasant conversation. I put on my best dark blue suit, the same one I'd married Sylvia in, carefully tailored to fit my now more massive figure. As I tied my tie, I looked at the picture of my wife standing on the dresser. She was smiling that special smile that was always reserved for me. Whatever you decide, Sylvia, I whispered, I'll accept it. Percival Notting's office was in an old brick building on Main Street, 2 blocks from the waterfront. 3 generations of Nottings had practiced law here, representing Biddeford's oldest families. Inside smelled of wood polish, old books, and time. The receptionist, Mrs. Weaver, who sat at her post for what seemed as long as the oak desk in front of her, greeted me with a nod. "Dash Mr. Dwyer," she said. "Dash Mr. Nodding is expecting you. The others have already arrived. The others. So Eloise and Kingsley are already here." No wonder they'd probably been up all night with anticipation. I entered Percival's office, a spacious room with mahogany paneling and tall windows facing the street. At the massive desk sat Percival himself, neat as ever, with a perfectly trimmed gray beard, wearing a three-piece suit. Opposite him, in leather visitors' chairs, were Eloise and Kingsley, both in black, as if they were still in mourning, though the expression on their faces spoke more of business than of grief. "Ah, Hubert," Percival rose, extending his hand. "Thank you for your punctuality." "Good morning, Percival." I shook his hand, then nodded to my daughter and son-in-law. "Eloise, Kingsley." Eloise gave me a cold smile, but Kingsley just nodded, his eyes already studying the papers on the table in front of Percival. "Have a seat, please." Percival pointed to the empty chair next to Eloise. "Let's get down to business." I sat down, feeling the tension radiating from my daughter. She sat up straight, clutching the small designer purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Percival coughed, put on his gold-rimmed glasses, and picked up the first document. "We are here to review the last will and testament of Sylvia Radley Dwyer," he began in a formal tone. "Before I begin reading the document, I want to note that Mrs. Dwyer spent many hours working with me on this will, especially in the last months of her life. She was of sound mind and good judgment, and her wishes were made very clear." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Eloise lean forward, her breathing quickening. Kingsley put his hand on her knee, a gesture meant to seem soothing, but it was impatient. "If I may," Eloise interrupted Percival abruptly, "we all realize that Mama was out of her mind. Let us get to the point. Time is short, and Kingsley and I still have an appointment in Portland." Percival looked at her over his glasses. "Of course, Miss Eloise. I'm just following protocol, so..." He began to recite the standard legal language, and as he spoke, I watched Eloise's impatience grow. Her fingers tapped on her purse, her legs twitching nervously. Kingsley maintained an outward calm, but his eyes were fixed on Percival's lips, as if he could quicken his reading by the force of his gaze. Finally, Percival reached the distribution of property. "Concerning my estate, including real estate, securities, bank accounts, art, jewelry, and all other property, both tangible and intangible, I dispose of as follows." Eloise pitched even further forward, practically sliding off the chair. Kingsley squeezed her knee tighter. "In view of the circumstances of my life," Percival continued, "and the special relationship with my family, I have made special provisions for inheriting the bulk of my estate, estimated at approximately $35 million. At the mention of the amount, Kingsley's eyes widened for a moment. "Nah, my only daughter, Eloise Cavendish, née Dwyer," Percival paused, looking at Eloise over his glasses, "will receive my entire inheritance if, for 1 month after my death, she shows proper respect and support for her father, Hubert Dwyer, by helping him through this difficult period of bereavement." Silence reigned in the room. Eloise froze, her face expressing a mixture of bewilderment and anxiety. Kingsley frowned, glancing quickly at me, then back at Percival. "In the event that this condition is not fulfilled," Percival continued, "the distribution of my estate shall be as follows. Hubert Dwyer, my beloved husband, will receive 80% of my entire estate. The remaining 20% will be divided between the Biddeford Benevolent Fund for the Poor and my daughter Eloise in equal shares." "What?" Eloise jumped up in her chair. "Is this some kind of a joke? It can't be." "I assure you, Miss Eloise, it is not a joke." Percival remained unperturbed. "Your mother was very clear in her wishes." But this is absurd." Eloise began to choke with indignation. "Some ridiculous conditions. Where did this idea even come from?" "Your mother," Percival replied patiently, "was concerned that after her death, you might misinterpret some of the family circumstances. She wanted to make sure that you would show proper respect for your father. It was you." Eloise turned to me sharply, her face contorted with anger. "Ah, you made her write that, manipulated her when she was weak and vulnerable." I shook my head silently, not wanting to get into an argument. For the first time since I started reading the will, I felt a slight smile touch my lips. Sylvia, my clever, perceptive Sylvia. She saw everything, understood everything. Miss Eloise, Percival took off his glasses and looked at her carefully. I can personally testify that your mother made this will on her own initiative. Mr. Dwyer had nothing to do with its contents. Moreover, I can say with certainty that he was not even aware of the specific terms until today. Kingsley, who had hitherto remained silent, finally intervened. Surinam, Percival, his voice was calculatedly calm. There must be some misunderstanding. Sylvia always told Eloise that she wanted her inheritance to stay in the family, that she would leave everything to her only daughter. And she would have, Percival retorted, if the condition had been fulfilled. Unfortunately, it was not. What do you mean? Kingsley's voice became tense. How can you say that the condition has not been fulfilled? It's only been a month. Percival put his glasses back on and picked up another document from the table. Mrs. Dwyer anticipated the matter, he said, and she left me, as executor of the will, clear instructions on how to assess the fulfillment of the condition. He began to read, I, Sylvia Radley Dwyer, instruct my trusted attorney, Percival Notting, to supervise the conduct of my daughter, Eloise Cavendish, with respect to her father after my death. Percival is to gather information from reliable sources about how Eloise treats Hubert, whether she supports him emotionally, helps him cope with his loss, and shows proper respect for his feelings and decisions. If Percival finds that Eloise has not fulfilled the condition, he must apply an alternative distribution of my estate as outlined in the main will. A heavy silence hung in the room. Eloise turned pale. Her hands trembled. Kingsley sat as if petrified, his gaze wandering between Percival and me. I finally asked, though I already knew the answer. Percival coughed. In accordance with Mrs. Dwyer's instructions, I investigated. I talked to Dr. Mortimer, to Mrs. Weaver, who lives next door to you, to several members of the church parish where Sylvia's funeral service was held. I also got information from the realtors whom Miss Eloise had invited to look at Mr. Dwyer's house. Eloise squirmed in her chair, her cheeks flaring. You were spying on me? Her voice trembled. I was following your mother's instructions, Percival replied calmly, and from the information I have gathered, I have concluded that you have failed to fulfill the condition of the will. Not only have you failed to support your father, but you have actively acted against him by spreading rumors that defame him, by planning to sell the house without his consent, by ignoring his emotional needs during the mourning period. That's slander. Eloise jumped to her feet. I will sue. I will contest this will. It's against the law. You have every right to contest the will, Percival said calmly, but I must warn you that your mother had foreseen this possibility. He took out another document. In the event that my daughter attempts to contest my will, I order that all documentation collected by Percival Notting, including evidence of her behavior after my death, be turned over to the court. I also leave a sealed letter to be opened only in the event of a trial containing my personal observations about my daughter's character and the true motives of her husband, Kingsley Cavendish. Kingsley, who had hitherto maintained some semblance of calm, now changed in his face also. His eyes darted to the sealed envelope lying on the edge of Percival's desk. What does it say? His voice trailed off. I'm afraid I don't know, Percival replied. The envelope is sealed, and I must open it only in case of a trial. Mrs. Dwyer was very specific on this point. Eloise slumped back in her chair, her face a mixture of shock and despair. Kingsley ran a hand through his hair, his self-confidence evaporating. It's impossible, he muttered. There must be some way out. I sat in silence, watching their plans fall apart. Did I feel satisfaction? Not really. Rather, it was a bitter confirmation of my fears about the character of my daughter and her husband. But even more, I felt deep gratitude to Sylvia for her wisdom and foresight. Percival coughed, drawing everyone's attention. There is something else I must read, he said, lifting the last piece of paper. It is a personal message from Mrs. Dwyer to you, Miss Eloise. Eloise raised her head, her eyes reddened with restrained tears. My dear Eloise, Percival began to read, if you hear these words, it means that you have not passed the test I have prepared for you. It breaks my heart, but it does not surprise me. I've watched years of you distancing yourself from your father, of letting Kingsley influence your judgment, of building a story in your head that has nothing to do with reality. Your father was never a dowry hunter, as you had led yourself to believe. On the contrary, he always insisted that we live within his means. He built his business with hard work, risked his life at sea to provide for us, you and me. And when I fell ill, he was there every minute, giving all of himself to ease my suffering. I hope that after my death you would see the truth, that you would see his pain and loneliness, that you would reach out to him like a daughter should reach out to her father, that you would appreciate his love, which was always deep and real, though not always expressed in words and gestures you could understand. But you chose a different path, and now you must bear the consequences of that choice. I still love you, my girl, and I hope that someday you will realize that I did not do this to punish you, but to show you the truth about your father, your husband, and yourself. With everlasting love, your mother, Sylvia. When Percival finished reading, there was complete silence in the room. I felt a single tear roll down my cheek. Sylvia, my Sylvia, had remained true to our love, our truth, to her last breath. Eloise sat with her head down, her shoulders shaking. Kingsley looked stunned, his gaze blank and unfocused. "Yeah, I can't believe it," Eloise finally whispered. "Mom couldn't have done this to me. It's all his fault." She jabbed a finger in my direction, suddenly regaining her voice. "He turned her against me. He manipulated her when she was weak." "Eloise," I finally spoke, my voice sounding surprisingly calm. "You still don't understand. Your mother saw right through you. She saw through both of you." I shifted my gaze to Kingsley, who now looked like he was about to fall through the ground. "She knew about your husband's financial problems, knew about your plans for her money, and most importantly, she knew that I was never the man you had painted me to be in your imagination. My mom's $35 million inheritance is mine," Eloise suddenly shouted, jumping to her feet. "You have no right to take it. No one has the right." Percival cringed at the outcry but kept his professional calm. "Miss Eloise, I'm afraid you have violated the terms of your mother's will. Legally, her inheritance will be distributed according to an alternative plan, 80% to Mr. Dwyer, 10% to you, and 10% to the Biddeford Charitable Foundation." "No!" Eloise stomped her foot, her face contorted in an ugly grimace. "I will not allow it. I will sue. I will prove that he manipulated her." "Please calm down, Miss Eloise." Percival was unperturbed. "As I said, you have the right to contest the will, but I must warn you that the chances of success are minimal, given the evidence gathered at your mother's behest and the letter she left for the court." Kingsley finally came out of his stupor and put his hand on his wife's shoulder. "Eloise, please sit down." His voice sounded strangely detached. We need to think about the situation." She shook off his hand. Consider what? How did this old man stole my money? My mother's money?" "Eloise." There was no anger in my voice, only wariness. "I never wanted your mother's money. I never needed it. I've always had enough of my own money, and I'd gladly give you the entire inheritance if you just treat me like a father instead of an enemy. If you hadn't tried to smear me in the eyes of the town, if you hadn't spread lies about how I supposedly didn't take care of your mother during her illness." Eloise stared at me, her eyes widening. You knew?" she whispered. "Biddeford is a small town," I replied. "People talk, and some of them have been my friends for decades. They told me what rumors you were spreading. And now what?" There was desperation in her voice. "You want me to beg? You want me to crawl at your feet for that money?" I shook my head. "No, Eloise. I just wanted you to be my daughter, but apparently it's too much for you." Percival coughed, interrupting our tense conversation. "If I may, I'd like to finish the formal part," he said. "There are still a few formalities we must attend to." Eloise sank silently into the chair, her face as white as chalk. Kingsley sat with his head down, his shoulders slumped. It was obvious that they were both in shock at the unexpected turn of events. I watched them, feeling a strange mixture of emotions, the bitterness at my daughter's final breakup, the satisfaction that the truth had finally been revealed, and Sylvia's deep gratitude for her final gift of protecting me from the greed of our own child. As Percival began to explain the details of the property transfer, I noticed Eloise and Kingsley's legs trembling as they sat back in their chairs, crushed by the reality of their defeat. All of their plans, all of their calculations, had fallen to ashes in that quiet mahogany-paneled room, under the unfazed gaze of Percival nodding, the faithful guardian of my beloved Sylvia's last will. After the reading of the will, Eloise and Kingsley literally flew out of Percival's office without a word. I stayed behind to discuss with him the practicalities of transferring the estate. When the formalities were settled, Percival took off his glasses and looked at me sympathetically. "Hubert, I must say that in all my years of practicing law, this is one of the most unusual wills I've ever encountered." Sylvia was an amazing woman. "Yes," I smiled sadly. "She always saw right through people. I just didn't think she saw our daughter as clearly as she did." "She was very worried about you," Percival said, gathering up the papers. "In the last few months, we talked a lot about what would happen afterward. She knew Eloise would never give up trying to get the inheritance, and she was ready for it." I nodded, feeling a heaviness in my chest. The thought of Sylvia spending her last strength to protect me from our own daughter was unbearably bitter. "What should I do with the money, Percival?" I asked. "I never wanted them. I have enough of my own money." He shrugged his shoulders. "It's your decision, Hubert. Sylvia trusted you to manage her inheritance wisely. She knew you wouldn't squander it, as Eloise and Kingsley might have done." I left Percival's office with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of strange relief. The truth had been revealed, the mask removed. I now knew exactly where I stood and who I was dealing with. The next few days passed in silence. No calls, no visits from Eloise or Kingsley. I immersed myself in my work, visiting the Dwyer Marine office daily for the first time in many months. Walter was glad to see me back at the helm of the company, although he was concerned about my haggard appearance. "Are you all right, old boy?" he asked as we went over the quarterly reports. "You look exhausted." "I'm going through a bad time with Eloise," I answered without elaborating. Walter nodded understandingly. He'd been at Sylvia's funeral and had probably noticed the tension between me and my daughter. "If you need help, any help, just let me know," he offered. "You know we're all family here." Those words touched me more deeply than I could have expected. Dwyer Marine was truly my second family. Employees, many of whom had worked with me for decades. Captains of my ships, crews, even young trainees. They all knew the real me, not the monster Eloise and Kingsley had painted in their imaginations. On the 7th day after the reading of the will, there was thunder. I was sitting in my office, sorting through a backlog of correspondence, when Percival called. "Hubert," his normally calm voice sounded tense. "They've filed a lawsuit. Eloise and Kingsley are contesting Sylvia's will." I sighed. I'd expected this, but it still hurt. "On what grounds?" "They claimed that Sylvia wasn't in her right mind when she made the will, that you exerted undue influence over her, taking advantage of her illness and vulnerability." Percival paused. "They'd hired Albert Connors. It was a name I knew, one of the most expensive and unscrupulous lawyers in New England, a man willing to turn heaven and earth upside down for the right price." "Where did they get the money for Connors?" I asked, more to myself than to Percival. "Probably made an agreement to pay if they won," he replied. "Connors likes that kind of deal, especially when it comes to large sums. 35 million is more than enough motivation." "What do we do?" "I'll represent you if you agree," Percival said. "We have the advantage that I've worked with Sylvia on the will and can testify to her mental state, plus the collected evidence of Eloise's behavior after Sylvia's death, and, of course, that sealed letter." "When do the hearings start?" "A month. Connors tried to speed things up, but Judge Harrington doesn't like to be pushed around." After Percival called, I sat looking out the window at the bay for a long time. Litigation. At 67, I'll be suing my own daughter for money I don't even want. It's ironic. The first signs of a new campaign to discredit me appeared the very next day. I noticed a change in the attitude of some of the townspeople. Leering glances, muffled conversations suddenly silenced at my appearance. At the Blue Clam, the situation repeated itself, but with a new twist. Now people weren't just avoiding me. Some were outright turning away. On Friday, I found out why. Walter walked into my office holding the latest issue of the Biddeford Gazette. "Did you see this?" he asked, placing the paper on my desk. On the third page was a small article with a screaming headline: "Family Drama in Dwyer House. Daughter accuses father of inheritance manipulation." The article quoted sources close to the family as saying that I allegedly took advantage of Sylvia's illness to get her to change the will in my favor, leaving my only daughter virtually destitute. "What nonsense," I muttered, crumpling the paper. "Everyone who knows you knows it's a lie," Walter said firmly. "But you have to know what's going on." Over the next week, the situation only got worse. More and more leaks and testimonies appeared in the local papers about my alleged abuse of Sylvia, about my pathological greed, about how I had controlled her condition for decades. Eloise even gave an interview to a local radio station where she tearfully described how I had been a cold and calculating father all my life, interested only in money and business. "My mother loved him no matter what," she said, her voice shaking with feigned excitement. "She always hoped he would change. And when she got sick, he just showed his true colors, refusing to pay for experimental treatments, insisting on cheap analog drugs, keeping her practically locked up so no one could influence her." I turned off the radio, unable to listen any further. This fictional story had nothing to do with reality, but Eloise told it so convincingly that even I almost believed it for a moment. That same evening, the doorbell rang. Dr. Mortimer stood on the threshold, his usually good-natured face frowning. "I had to come, Hubert," he said without preamble. "This gossip, this slander, it's intolerable." I invited him into the house and we sat down in the parlor, the same parlor where Eloise and Kingsley had once discussed how Sylvia's inheritance would be handled. "They contacted me," Mortimer said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "That lawyer, Connors, tried to get me to sign a statement saying that you'd allegedly refused to pay for some innovative treatments for Sylvia." "And what did you say?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I told him he could shove his statement where the sun don't look. Mortimer gave me a weak smile. "And then I informed him that I was prepared to testify under oath that you did everything you could for Sylvia, that we consulted with the best oncologists in the country, that you never refused any treatment that could help her, no matter the cost." I felt a lump come up in my throat. "Thank you, James. That, it means a lot to me." "Don't thank me," he waved his hand. "I just can't stand lies, especially a lie like that, so dirty." Mortimer wasn't the only one who came to support me. The next day, Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper who had helped us during Sylvia's illness, showed up. "Dash Mr. Dwyer," she said, her strained hands crumpling her handkerchief nervously. "This young woman, your daughter, she offered me money to tell me that she saw you treat Mrs. Dwyer roughly, like she heard you yelling at her when she asked for medicine." I felt a chill go down my spine. "And what did you say, Mrs. Harrison?" I said, "I'm not for sale." Her chin rose proudly. "I've worked in Biddeford houses for 40 years, and my reputation is worth more than any money, especially money offered for lying about a good man like you, Mr. Dwyer." I was touched by her loyalty, but also deeply troubled. If Eloise and Kingsley were trying to bribe witnesses, how far could they go? And how many people, unlike Dr. Mortimer and Mrs. Harrison, would agree to this deal? My fears were confirmed a few days later when Percival called again. "Cherie, Connors has witnesses," he said without preamble. 3. The hospice nurse, the gardener who worked for you last summer, and some distant relative of Sylvia's, a second-degree cousin no one's ever seen. What are they going to say? Standard stuff. That you mistreated Sylvia, that she was afraid of you, that you controlled her every move and isolated her from family and friends. Percival sighed. Connor's usual tactic is to get a lot of witnesses, hoping something will stick. But don't worry, we have Sylvia's sealed letter and plenty of real witnesses, including the medical staff who actually worked with her on a regular basis. However, it's one thing to have the truth on your side, and quite another to confront a well-organized campaign to discredit it. By the end of the second week after the lawsuit was filed, the atmosphere in Biddeford had become downright hostile. Some stores where I had been a regular customer for decades suddenly could not fulfill my orders. A table at my favorite restaurant was invariably occupied, even when the room was empty. One morning I found the word bastard crudely scrawled on the gate of my house. Meanwhile, Eloise had become a local celebrity. She gave interviews, attended charity events, posed as a grief-stricken daughter, and devoted guardian of her mother's memory. Kingsley kept a low profile, but I knew he was the one pulling the strings. His financial problems were apparently getting more and more serious. My banking contacts hinted that Cavendish was up to his eyeballs in debt. One evening on my way home from the office, I was intercepted by Kingsley on a quiet street near my house. He got out of a parked car and blocked my way. "Hubert," he said with a friendly smile, "we need to talk." "I think all conversations are through our lawyers now," I replied coldly. "Come on." He took a step closer. "We're family. Can't we just settle this like human beings?" I looked him straight in the eye. "What exactly are you suggesting, Kingsley?" He looked around as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then lowered his voice. "It's no good for anybody. Not you, not us. Everyone's reputation suffers. Maybe we can work out a deal. Say 50-50. You get half of Sylvia's inheritance, we get the other half, and everybody's happy." I felt anger rising inside me. After all the things you've said about me, after all the lies and slander, after trying to bribe witnesses, do you really think I'm going to shake your hand and split the money? Kingsley tensed, his fake smile disappearing. "Be reasonable, Hubert. You're not getting any younger. Why do you want all this trouble? Why do you need all that money? What are you going to do with it?" "It's none of your business," I said. "But I can assure you it's going to a good cause. Something Sylvia would approve of." He narrowed his eyes. "Do you realize we're not stopping? No matter what that old fool Percival says, no matter how slick Sylvia's will is, we'll find a way to contest it. And believe me, there will be publicity for it. By the end of the trial, your name will be synonymous with greed and cruelty, not just in Biddeford, but all of Maine. Are you threatening me?" I took a step toward him, and he stepped back. "Do whatever you want, Kingsley. I know the truth, and those who really matter know it too. Now get out of my way." He backed away, but he still took one last shot. "She didn't love you, you know. Sylvia. She'd been telling Eloise for the last few months that she regretted marrying you." I just laughed in his face. "If you really believe that, then you're a bigger fool than I thought." With those words, I walked past him, feeling his hateful stare on my back. For the next 2 weeks before the trial began, the discrediting campaign reached its peak. A large article appeared in the local newspaper consisting almost entirely of lies and innuendo about my life with Sylvia. Anonymous sources claimed that I controlled her every move, forbade her to see her friends, withheld information about her illness from Eloise. But the most painful blow was a series of photographs published in the same newspaper. Heavily edited shots of Sylvia in the last months of her life, where she looked exhausted and unhappy. Next to them were pictures of Eloise carefully holding her mother's hand. The caption read, "True love versus cold calculation. Who really cared for Sylvia Dwyer in her last days?" It was too much. I called Percival. "They're out of line," I said, barely containing my anger. "To use Sylvia's pictures like that, it's just disgusting." "I agree," Percival said. "And it could be to our advantage. It shows their true colors." "Don't worry, Hubert. The truth always comes out," but Percival's words gave me little comfort. Every day I woke up with a heavy weight on my heart, knowing I was in for another round of lies and slander. My home, once filled with love and happiness, now seemed like a fortress besieged on all sides. One morning, about a week before the trial began, I found on my doorstep a bouquet of white lilies, Sylvia's favorite flowers, and a small note. "We believe you," it said in neat handwriting. The note was unsigned, but this simple gesture of support touched me to the core. Gradually, I began to notice other signs of solidarity. Some people in town who had previously avoided me now nodded when they met me, or even stopped to say a few words of encouragement. The owner of the Blue Oyster personally brought me a drink when I walked in that evening, and loudly announced that his establishment always welcomed real Biddeford people, not upstarts with expensive lawyers. It seemed that the pendulum of public opinion was beginning to swing the other way. The more aggressive Eloise and Kingsley's campaign became, the more people began to doubt their sincerity. 3 days before the trial began, another important event occurred. A local radio station, the same one where Eloise had given her tearful interview, invited Dr. Mortimer to talk about the medical aspects of Sylvia's illness. Instead of a dry medical report, Mortimer gave a passionate speech about how I had cared for my wife in her final months. "I've been practicing medicine in this town for 35 years, he said, "and rarely have I seen the kind of devotion and love that Hubert Dwyer showed for his wife. He didn't just pay all the bills. He was there every day, reading to her when her eyes were tired, spoon-feeding her when she was too weak, spent nights in the hospital chair, holding her hand so she wouldn't feel alone. And all this talk about him supposedly refusing treatment is just a lie." Sylvia Dwyer received the best care possible for her diagnosis. This speech had a bombshell effect. Mortimer was a respected member of the community. His word was trusted. After his interview, several other people also came forward to support me. Nurses who had worked with Sylvia, longtime friends, even former Dwyer Marine employees who told me what a caring husband and father I had always been. On the eve of the trial, I sat on the veranda for a long time looking out over the bay. The sea was choppy, the waves crashing noisily against the shore, as if to herald a storm. I thought of Sylvia, of our life together, of how strange things had turned out. I'd never thought I'd be suing my own daughter for money I didn't even need, defending the memory of our love that she'd tried so desperately to sully. Percival's call found me there on the veranda. "Everything is ready, Hubert," he said. "The hearings begin tomorrow. I'm sure the truth will prevail." "You know, Percival," I said, as I watched the setting sun turn the waves golden, "it doesn't matter to me so much who gets the money anymore. What matters is that the truth about Sylvia, about our life together, is not distorted by lies and slander." "Sorn, and it won't be," Percival said confidently. "Tomorrow I will open that sealed letter that Sylvia left behind, and everything will come to a head." As I hung up the phone, I continued to stare out at the sea. Tomorrow. Tomorrow the trial would begin, which would decide not only the fate of Sylvia's inheritance, but also how this small seaside town would remember our history. A history that Eloise and Kingsley had tried to rewrite for money, but which I was determined to protect at all costs. The York County Courthouse was housed in a stately red brick building in the center of Biddeford. I arrived early, an hour before the appointed time. Percival was waiting for me on the steps, impeccable as ever in his dark gray suit and neatly trimmed beard. "Ready?" he asked, shaking my hand. "As ready as I can be," I answered. "I don't like public introductions." "Unfortunately, it's unavoidable," Percival sighed, "especially with Connors as the opponent. He likes drama." We entered the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the small crowd of reporters gathered at the main entrance. Our case had generated considerable interest. It wasn't every day that a $35 million inheritance drama played out in a small seaside town. The courtroom was filling up fast. I noticed many familiar faces, neighbors, business associates, family friends. Some nodded at me in encouragement, others looked away. In the front row sat Dr. Mortimer, who smiled encouragingly at me. Next to him sat Mrs. Harrison and several of the nurses who had cared for Sylvia in recent months. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors opened and Eloise and Kingsley entered, accompanied by Albert Connors, a tall man with silver whiskers and a predatory smile. Eloise was dressed in all black, creating the image of a grieving daughter. Kingsley, in a dark blue suit, looked tense and pale. They sat down at the table across from us without even dignifying me with a glance. Connors, on the other hand, nodded confidently at Percival and me, as if we were gathered for a friendly round of golf, not a court battle. "On your feet. The Court of York County, Maine, is now in session. The Honorable Judge Elizabeth Harrington presiding," the bailiff announced. Judge Harrington, a woman in her 60s with shrewd brown eyes and a stern expression, took her seat. She was known for her open-mindedness and her rejection of any attempt to turn the court into a circus. "Case number 7491, Cavendish versus Dwyer," she announced, "contesting the will of Sylvia Radley Dwyer. Mr. Connors, do you represent the plaintiffs?" Connors began his speech, painting me as a ruthless manipulator and a greedy businessman who had spent a lifetime planning to seize his wife's fortune. He called the first witness, a hospice nurse who claimed to have seen me abuse Sylvia, denying her pain medication and forbidding her to see her daughter. Percival quickly proved that this woman had never worked with Sylvia and was not even a nurse. The same thing happened with Connor's other witnesses. Their testimony fell apart under cross-examination. After the lunch break, Connors called up his main card. Eloise. My daughter looked flawless in her black dress, with a pale face and slightly trembling hands, the perfect image of a grieving daughter. She spoke of her supposedly close relationship with her mother, of my coldness, of how I refused to take Sylvia to counseling sessions in other states and controlled her life. Percival easily refuted these allegations by showing that Eloise visited her mother only 4 times in the last year of her life, while Sylvia and I visited the best cancer clinics in the country, including centers in Minnesota, Boston, and New York. By the end of the first day of the trial, Connor's position had visibly weakened. His witnesses had been discredited, and Eloise and Kingsley's testimony was undermined by Percival's cross-examination. On the second day of trial, it was our turn to present evidence. Dr. Mortimer, the nurses, the housekeeper, and our friends all spoke with one voice about my devotion to Sylvia and the care I had surrounded her with during her illness. Finally, Percival came to the climax of our defense. Your Honor, he said, we have one more piece of evidence which I believe will finally clarify Mrs. Dwyer's will and the reasons why she made the will in the way she did. He took out a sealed envelope. This is the letter Mrs. Dwyer left specifically in case her daughter contested the will. It was sealed in my presence and kept in the safe of my office. I asked permission to open it and read the contents. Judge Harrington granted permission, and Percival carefully opened the envelope, taking out several sheets of paper written in Sylvia's familiar handwriting. If anyone is reading this letter, he began, it means that my daughter Eloise has decided to contest my will. I am not surprised, but deeply disappointed. A few months before I died, I overheard a conversation between my daughter and her husband Kingsley. They did not know that I had returned home earlier than usual after treatment. They were talking about my condition, how soon I would die, and what they would do with my inheritance. Kingsley said, once the old woman kicks back on her skates, we can finally pay off our debts and start living properly. $35 million is more than enough to cover all the holes and still have enough left over for a life of luxury. My daughter replied, I hope it happens soon. I'm tired of waiting. What are we going to do with the old man? Kingsley said, oh, that's easy. We'll sell the house right out from under him. We'll say he's not fit to live on his own, stick him in some cheap nursing home. Or maybe we'll get lucky and he'll soon follow your mother. I should also disclose that shortly before my death, I hired a private investigator to investigate Kingsley Cavendish's financial situation. What I found out shocked me. My son-in-law was mired in debt due to failed investments and a secret gambling addiction. He owed substantial sums to dangerous people and used his marriage to my daughter as a way to get to the Radley family fortune. Attached to the detective's report are copies of Kingsley's promissory notes, statements from secret offshore accounts, and records of his visits to underground gambling establishments in Boston and New York. It also contains audio recordings of conversations where he discusses with his creditors plans to pay off as soon as the old hag gives up the ends. My dear Eloise was unaware of most of these debts. She was her husband's accomplice in his plans to seize my inheritance, but had no idea of the true extent of his financial problems. There was absolute silence in the hall. I looked at Eloise and Kingsley. My daughter was pale as a sheet, her hands trembling. Kingsley looked like he was about to vomit. Your Honor, Percival continued, attached to Mrs. Dwyer's letter are documents that support all of her allegations. The detective's report, Mr. Cavendish's financial records, and audio recordings of conversations between the Cavendish couple and Mr. Cavendish and his creditors. Connors jumped to his feet in an attempt to challenge the authenticity of the documents, but Judge Harrington quickly overruled his objections after seeing notarizations and expert testimony about the authenticity of the audio recordings. We also have Mr. Cavendish's phone records with his creditors in Boston, Percival added. These recordings were obtained legally as part of an investigation ordered by Mrs. Dwyer. He turned on one of the tapes and a hard male voice filled the courtroom. Kingsley, you owe me $400,000 for the 3rd month. My patience is not infinite. When do you plan to pay it off? And Kingsley's response, look, Vince, you know the situation. My wife's mother is dying. As soon as she kicks back on her skates, we'll have $35 million. Your money will be first in line, I promise. Eloise turned slowly toward Kingsley, her face expressing shock and disbelief. He avoided her gaze, staring at the floor. "There's another recording, Your Honor," Percival said. "It was made at the Dwyer house a week before Mrs. Dwyer died, when the Cavendish couple didn't know she was in the next room. This tape showed Eloise and Kingsley discussing how they would sell the house, get rid of the old man, and start a new life with Sylvia's money." Eloise's laughter sounded especially creepy when Kingsley suggested that he would accidentally push me down the stairs after receiving the inheritance. As the recording continued, Eloise's face became more and more contorted with horror, not so much at the content of the conversation, but at the realization that her mother had heard it all. Kingsley sat with his hands covering his face. Judge Harrington listened intently to the tapes, her face impassive, but her eyes filled with disgust. "Mr. Connors," she turned to the plaintiff's attorney when the tape was over. "In light of the evidence presented, do you still insist that the case be continued?" Connors looked confused. He leaned toward Eloise and Kingsley, quietly discussing something with them. Finally, he straightened up. "Your Honor, in light of the new circumstances, my clients would like to take a recess for counseling. A recess for 30 minutes will be granted," the judge nodded. When we returned to the courtroom after the recess, Kingsley was absent. Eloise was sitting alone next to Connors, her face pale and frozen, her eyes red with tears. "Your Honor," Connors spoke, "my clients have decided to withdraw the suit. Mr. Cavendish had to leave unexpectedly on urgent business. Mrs. Cavendish admits that she acted under the influence of false information and emotion and does not wish to continue the lawsuit." Judge Harrington looked at Eloise. "Mrs. Cavendish, do you affirm that ruling?" Eloise nodded without raising her eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was barely audible. "In that case," the judge tapped her gavel, "the suit is dismissed. The will of Sylvia Radley Dwyer is recognized as valid in all its aspects. Mr. Dwyer is the legal heir to 80% of the deceased's estate, subject to the terms set forth in the will." She paused, then added, "I must note that the evidence presented today warrants a criminal investigation of Mr. Cavendish on charges of fraud and attempted misappropriation of inheritance. I will forward the appropriate materials to the district attorney's office." With those words, she banged the gavel, concluding the session. As we were leaving the courtroom, Eloise suddenly blocked my path. Her face was contorted with a mixture of anger, shame, and despair. "Are you satisfied?" she hissed. "You ruined my life. Kingsley ran away with the last of the money from our accounts. He used me, and I was too blind to see it." I looked at her sadly, but without sympathy. "You ruined your own life, Eloise. Your greed, your contempt for me and your mother's memory. Kingsley just took advantage of it." "I hate you," she whispered. "I always have. You never loved me the way you loved your ships, your business." "That's not true, and you know it," I replied calmly. "I loved you more than anything in the world. But you chose a different path, and now you have to live with the consequences of your choice." I walked around her and left the courthouse, where Percival was waiting for me. The sun was shining outside, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth had triumphed, and Sylvia's memory was untainted by lies and slander. But in my heart, I still felt the bitterness of loss, not only of my wife, but also of my daughter, who had chosen money and lies over love and truth. I returned to my house on the hill after the trial in a strange state of desolation. The victory had proved bitter. I had proved my case, protected Sylvia's memory from slander, but I had lost my daughter, perhaps forever. Although, to be honest with myself, I had lost her long before that trial. The next morning, the Biddeford newspapers were abuzz with headlines about the conclusion of the Dwyer case, as they called it. Reporters relished every detail: Kingsley's secret debts, the notes made by Sylvia, the sudden disappearance of my brother-in-law. Eloise had gone from being the unfortunate disinherited daughter to a cold-blooded accomplice in the plans to seize her mother's fortune. Percival called me around noon. "Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "Only the local papers," I answered, looking out the window at the bay. "Big noise in a small town." "Not just in a small town," Percival hummed. "The Boston Globe and even the New York Times picked up the story. Rich heiress, Secret debts, gambling, betrayal, a great story for journalists. Speaking of which, there's news on Kingsley. What's that? He was spotted at Logan Airport last night, apparently boarded a flight to Panama. The DA's office has already put out an APB on his whereabouts, but the chances of extradition. You know? I sighed. Kingsley had escaped, leaving Eloise to deal with the consequences of their shared actions. Can't say that surprised me. What about Eloise? Percival was silent for a moment. She's still in town, at Harborview. As far as I know, she found their joint accounts empty. Kingsley took everything, including her personal savings. Even her wedding ring disappeared from the hotel safe. Despite everything that had happened, I felt a pang of regret. Eloise was my daughter despite her betrayal. Had she contacted you? Percival asked, interrupting my musings. No, I doubt she'd even want to see me. I shook my head, though Percival couldn't see that over the phone. Well, let's talk about more important things. What do we need to do about Sylvia's inheritance? I spent the next few weeks working with Percival and the financial advisors to organize the transfer of Sylvia's assets. 80% of her estate, about $28 million, now belonged to me. 10% went to the Biddeford Charitable Trust and another 10% to Eloise, though I doubted she would keep the money for long, given Kingsley's debts, which she probably didn't even realize she had. One evening, as I sat on the veranda with a glass of whiskey, watching the sunset over the bay, an idea struck me. This whole story is not just my personal tragedy. How many other elderly people are victims of greed and manipulation by their own children or other relatives? How many of them do not have the protection that Sylvia had provided me with her thoughtful will? The next day I met with Percival and outlined my plan, a fund to protect the elderly from financial fraud. He stroked his beard, mulling over the idea. It's an interesting concept, Hubert, and I must admit, quite relevant. We lawyers often come across cases like this, but we can rarely do anything about it without solid evidence, which is hard to obtain. Exactly, I leaned forward, feeling a growing excitement. The foundation could provide legal aid to the elderly, fund private investigators in complex cases, conduct educational programs, and help victims rebuild their finances after a scam. Sylvia protected me with her foresight, but many people don't have those opportunities. Percival smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I saw genuine respect in his eyes. You've always been a man of action, Hubert. Even in grief, you find a way to do something meaningful. Sylvia would be proud. Those words touched me more deeply than I expected. Yes, Sylvia would approve. She always valued practical solutions and real help more than empty gestures. Over the next month, I plunged headlong into the work of setting up the foundation. Percival and I hired a small team of elder law attorneys, financial planning consultants, and social workers. I decided to name the organization the Sylvia Dwyer Foundation for the Elderly and set aside $10 million of my inherited funds for seed money. The foundation's office was located in a small but cozy building near downtown Biddeford. I insisted that the premises be fully accessible to people with disabilities, with wide doorways for wheelchairs and special equipment for hearing and visually impaired visitors. The opening of the foundation attracted the attention of not only the local media, but also several national publications. The story of a wealthy widower who created a charitable organization after his daughter tried to disinherit him proved attractive to journalists. I was reluctant to give interviews, but realized that publicity would help the foundation reach those who needed its help more quickly. Your story is inspiring, Mr. Dwyer, said a young journalist from the Boston Globe during one such interview. How are you coping with your daughter's betrayal? I paused, choosing my words. This is not a story about betrayal or revenge, I finally answered. It's a story about protecting vulnerable people, about justice. My personal situation is just a catalyst for something more important. And yet, the reporter insisted, have you had any contact with your daughter since the trial? No, I shook my head. Some bridges cannot be rebuilt. But life goes on, and it is important to find new meaning in it. The foundation got off to a fast start, and in the first few weeks we had dozens of elderly people from Biddeford and the surrounding area contact us. Their stories ranged from minor financial fraud by distant relatives to serious cases of emotional and financial abuse by close family members. One of our first clients was Harold Pemberton, a 74-year-old widower whose nephew had been swindling money from him for years under the pretense of investing in a non-existent business. We helped Harold not only recover some of the funds through the courts, but also protect the remaining assets from further encroachment. I never thought I could stand up to Robert, Harold told me with tears in his eyes when the case was won. He was always so persuasive, so family-oriented. I believed he was just in a difficult situation. The most dangerous predators often wear the masks of loved ones, I replied, remembering Kingsley's smile and his sarcastic speeches. In October, about 3 months after the trial, Dr. Mortimer came to my office unexpectedly. He looked worried. "Hubert," he said without preamble, "I have just seen Eloise at the city hospital." I put aside the papers I was looking over. "What's wrong with her?" "Physically, nothing serious. Exhaustion, dehydration. But psychologically, she's not at her best." Mortimer sighed. "She's lost a lot of weight, doesn't look well groomed." According to the nurses, she'd been living in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town for the last few weeks, barely leaving the room. I felt a heaviness in my chest. Despite everything she'd done, Eloise was still my daughter. "Does she know you came to see me?" "No," Mortimer shook his head. "I think she would have objected, but I thought you should know." After Mortimer left, I sat for a long time looking out the window at the busy street. People were hurrying about their business, unaware of the dramas playing out behind closed doors. My own drama was publicized, but the most painful aspects of it remained hidden from view. The next morning I visited the city hospital. The nurse at the front desk recognized me. The news about the foundation and the inheritance story had made my face recognizable in Biddeford. "Mr. Dwyer," she smiled. "What can I do for you?" "I'd like to inquire about Eloise Cavendish's condition. She's my daughter." The nurse's smile faded slightly. Obviously, she knew the story. "Of course, sir. Mrs. Cavendish is in room 312. But I must warn you, she had indicated in her paperwork that she did not wish any visitors, especially family members." I nodded, not surprised, but still disappointed. "I understand. In that case, could you please give her something from me?" I took out the envelope I had prepared in advance and placed it on the counter. "Of course, Mr. Dwyer." The nurse took the envelope. "I will personally give it to Mrs. Cavendish." In the envelope was a short letter and a check for a substantial sum of money. Enough for Eloise to start a new life somewhere away from Biddeford if she wanted to. "Eloise," I wrote, "despite everything that has happened, you are my daughter, and I don't want you to suffer. This check is not from your mother's inheritance, but from my personal funds. Use it to get back on your feet and find your way. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Your father, Hubert." I did not expect a reply, and there was none. 3 days later, Mortimer informed me that Eloise had been discharged from the hospital. The check, according to the bank clerks, she cashed the same day. Where she went after that, I didn't know. Life went on, the foundation grew, attracting more attention and support not only in Maine, but in neighboring states as well. By the end of the year, we had opened branches in Portland and Bangor and launched an emergency counseling hotline for seniors facing financial pressure from relatives. In December, as the first snow covered Biddeford in a white blanket, I received an unexpected visit. Walter Penbrook, my deputy at Dwyer Marine, came to the foundation office with a business proposal. "Hubert," he said, settling into a chair across from my desk, "the company misses you. I realize you have a new vocation, but we miss your experience and vision." I smiled, touched by his words. "Nashan, Walter, you're doing just fine without me. The numbers are even better than they were under me." "Only because you've built a great foundation," he shook his head. "But I'm not talking about a full comeback. You could be chairman of the board, a strategic consultant. That would allow you to stay connected to your life's work without giving up the foundation." I've been thinking. Walter was right. I miss the sea, the ships, the business decisions and challenges that had filled my life for so long. The foundation gave me a sense of purpose and meaning, but Dwyer Marine was always a part of me. "You know, it's not such a bad idea," I finally said. "Let's discuss the details after the holidays." I spent Christmas alone, at my and Sylvia's house. Percival had invited me to celebrate with his family, but I declined. I needed that time alone with my memories. I put up a small fir tree in the living room, as we always did with Sylvia, hung her favorite ornaments, the hand-painted glass balls she had collected over the years. For the first time since her death, I didn't feel a suffocating longing, rather a quiet acceptance and gratitude for our years together. On New Year's Eve, while going through the mail, I discovered a postcard with no return address. On the cover was a picture of a winter landscape, a snow-covered forest and a frozen lake. Inside were just a few words written in familiar handwriting. "Thanks for your help. I'm fine. Eoi." That was it. No apologies, no requests, no accusations. Just a brief confirmation that Eloise was alive and at least on some level acknowledging my help. It wasn't reconciliation, not even close, but it was something. A small step in an uncertain direction. I put the card on the mantelpiece next to Sylvia's picture. Looking at them, I thought about the strange paths life takes, about love, betrayal, loss, and new beginnings, about money which can be both a blessing and a curse. In the spring, Percival and I expanded the Foundation's work by adding a microloan program for older entrepreneurs who wanted to start a small business after retirement. The idea came after we were approached by 70-year-old Martha Wilkins, a former seamstress whose son was trying to get her to sell her house and move into a nursing home to access her savings. We helped her protect her assets and then funded her to open a small tailoring and clothing repair shop. I often thought about Eloise, wondering where she was and what was happening to her. Sometimes when I woke up at night, I remembered her as a child, an inquisitive girl with Sylvia's gray eyes who loved it when I told her stories about the sea. What had gone wrong? At what point did love turn to alienation and then to open hostility? Could it be that I really wasn't paying enough attention to her, too immersed in my work? Or was it Kingsley's influence that had changed her so drastically? I realized I would never have answers to these questions. Some things remain unresolved, like a broken vase that can't be glued back together. And that too must be accepted. One day, almost a year after the trial, while perusing the morning paper over a cup of coffee on the veranda, I came across a small note in the society section. Eloise Dwyer, ex-Cavendish, opens contemporary art gallery in Portland. Attached to the article was a photo. Eloise, slimmed down but healthy looking, standing in front of a small building with a sign that read, "Gray Gallery." She had gotten her maiden name back and seemed to have found a new direction in life. I clipped out the note and put it in my desk drawer. Not to visit the gallery someday, I realized my appearance would be unwelcome, but simply as an affirmation that life goes on, even after the most trying times. In the spring of my 68th birthday, I finally realized that I had found a new balance in life. The foundation was thriving, helping dozens of seniors each month. My role as a strategic advisor at Dwyer Marine allowed me to stay connected to my life's work without getting bogged down in the routine of day-to-day management. I developed new friends, new interests, even a few hobbies. I started learning to play the piano, an instrument Sylvia had always loved. Sometimes sitting on the veranda with a glass of whiskey, watching the sunset over the bay, I thought about how strange my life had turned out, about the woman I loved for 40 years and lost too soon, about the daughter I lost while still alive, about the money that had never been my goal, but had become the cause of a family tragedy and then a tool to help others. Eloise remained convinced that I had somehow stolen her inheritance by manipulating her mother, a fact I knew from the occasional rumors that reached me through mutual acquaintances. She refused to admit her mistakes, preferring to see herself as the victim. Maybe that made it easier for her to live with herself. I accepted it as I had accepted many things in my life, with sadness, but without bitterness. After all, each of us lives in a world created by our own perceptions. My world now was my memories of Sylvia, my work for a foundation that helps those in need of protection, and quiet evenings on the veranda overlooking the bay, where each sunset reminded me that life is not what we lose, but what we make of what remains.